This is Chapter 5, Lesson 2. In our first part of Chapter 5, we looked at the plasma membrane and its components, which are primarily the phospholipids of the bilayer and proteins, either integral or peripheral proteins. So now we're going to focus more on the proteins to start and what different functions they might have in the cell membrane. So here are some examples of functions that proteins involved with the plasma membrane can have, including transport of materials, either through like a tunnel type of protein or one that has to operate using energy in the form of ATP. Now we're going to focus primarily on this for the rest of the lesson, on the transport proteins. But do recognize that there are other types of proteins that are involved with the plasma membrane. Some are enzymes. Some are involved in sending a signal or a message. These could be molecules that they receive from other cells that are received by receptors embedded in the membrane, and then that signal gets transmitted into the cell. Another example of a function proteins can have involved in the membrane is cell-to-cell recognition, as shown here in Part D. Intercellular joining, and points of attachment to cytoskeleton on the inside of the cell, or extracellular matrix, which is ECM, on the outside of the cell. That would be specifically for an animal cell, though. They're the only ones that have that extracellular matrix. So now we're going to focus on the transport proteins and how the plasma membrane can regulate the types of molecules that pass directly through the membrane versus through protein channels of different types. And sometimes this requires no energy, and sometimes it does. The process through which molecules can pass across the membrane without any energy is called passive transport. Diffusion is the mechanism through which those materials move from an area of higher to lower solute concentration of that particular molecule. So illustrated here are three different scenarios of diffusion, because the molecules, the purple circles, the orange triangles, and the blue circles are going in the direction from where there's a high concentration of them to where there's a low concentration on the other side of the membrane. So that is, by definition, diffusion. Now, some diffusion occurs directly through the bilayer. That's simple diffusion. And that's, again, just because of the nature of those molecules to want to reach like an equilibrium, where there's an equal number relatively on opposite sides of the membrane. With the scenarios in the middle and on the right, those molecules cannot just go directly through the bilayer. They need the aid of a protein to do so. So these are types of facilitated diffusion, where you either have a channel protein, which would be the one represented in the middle, or a carrier protein, which would represent the one shown on the far right. I have a few examples coming up of channel and carrier proteins. One type of channel protein is called an aquaporin, and this is a protein that's specifically designated for transporting bulk amounts of water across the plasma membrane. Although water can go directly across the lipid bilayer, it takes much longer than if it were able to go through an aquaporin. How this channel works is pretty interesting. There's a hydrophilic region at the interior of the channel, here shown in red. It says positively charged center. So that charge makes it hydrophilic, and it attracts the slight negative charge of the oxygen molecules on the water. So that's what's drawing them in, is that hydrophilic nature of the channel that attracts the hydrophilic water molecules. And then the flow continues because of adhesion to the aquaporin, cohesion of the water molecules to themselves. And so now they can flow into the cell. So that is a channel protein. The reason it's a channel protein is because it's like a tunnel that's always open. Okay, now that's in contrast to the next type, which are the carrier proteins. The channel isn't always open. What it has in common, though, to a channel protein is that there's a specific molecule that it can interact with. Like aquaporins are only designated for transporting water. So these carrier proteins and channel proteins have a specific molecule that they can facilitate the transportation of. So as shown here, we have a glucose carrier protein in mammals. So this protein here, it's an integral membrane protein, can only bind glucose. Now, once the glucose binds with the site that activates that protein to change its configuration, basically change its shape, and then allow that glucose to then be dispensed inside the cell. Now, although we're not seeing like all the glucose molecules on either side of the cell, this would have to be following that same rule of diffusion where you would have a higher concentration of the glucose on the outside of the cell. So I'm going to use the brackets to represent concentration, high glucose concentration on the extracellular side, and then there would be a low glucose concentration on the intercellular side. Oh, I lost a word. Low. Because it's too close to the edge there. Let's see. Let's try this again. It doesn't like something about that spot. I'm not sure what's going on, so one more try. I have to type the box bigger. That's it. Okay. Still learning. I have to make the box and then type in it. There we go. All right. Now let's move on. Now back to the water that moves through the membrane. When water moves across the plasma membrane of a cell, that process has a specific name, which is osmosis. It is a type of diffusion, but it's specifically the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane. That is the definition of osmosis. Now, because it's still diffusion, it's still going to follow the rule where the water molecules themselves are moving from an area where there's a higher concentration to a lower concentration of water. So that's what the last statement here is referring to. Water diffuses from the region of higher free water concentration to the region of lower free water concentration. Free water just refers to anything that's not a solute. Most cells, most living cells have multiple solutes. So if you were to add all of those solutes together and get like a total solute concentration, water would be everything else besides the solutes. So you can also look at the definition of osmosis from the perspective of how much total solute concentration there is. Water will diffuse from the region of lower total solute concentration to the region of higher total solute concentration. It's still going in the same direction. It's just from which perspective you're describing the movement of the water, either with respect to how much water there is or how much solute there is. And I think to understand this, it's good to look at some examples, which we'll have in class, but at least a pictorial first. On the next slide, we have an illustration of this. You have a selectively permeable membrane in the middle here. The gray dashed lines would represent like a plasma membrane. So notice that there's some gaps in between to show where the molecules can pass. but only certain molecules can pass. It says here in the notes that water molecules can pass through, but the sugar cannot. The green blobs, those are supposed to represent sugar molecules. They're too big. They can't get through on their own through simple diffusion, but the water can. So this is osmosis, because the water's going to go from an area where you have higher to lower free water concentration. So notice that on the left side of the membrane, there's a lot more water molecules packed in to the same space than the right side. So on the left, you'd say that there's a higher concentration of water compared to on the right side. There'd be a lower concentration of water. So then the water goes from high to low based on its own concentration. But if you wanted to look at it from the perspective of the solute, focusing on this note, this side on the right has more solute molecules and fewer free water molecules. So you have, just focus on the green blobs now. Again, that would be a sugar or the solute, whatever it might be. There's more per the volume here compared to on the left. So you could say on the right side has a higher concentration of total solutes, even though there's only one solute. Let's write it out because you're going to see some scenarios where there's more than one type of solute. Oh, we have the text box being too small again. Okay, higher concentration of total solutes. So according to that rule, you're looking at the movement of water from the area of lower total solute to higher total solute because the water's trying to disperse and spread out those solute molecules. And so indeed that is also true. The direction of osmosis, as shown at the bottom in the blue arrow, is from left to right. That's the net flow of water molecules from the left to the right because of the concentrations of the water and the solute molecules. Now you might notice that one arrow is actually going the opposite direction. It's not a mistake. This guy here. And that's because there's nothing that prevents the water molecules from bouncing back and forth across the membrane. They can do so passively without any energy, just because of the random motion of the particles. Sometimes some are going to pop back over across the net flow of osmosis, but for every one of those, there's 3 going from left to right. So that's the net movement. The majority of the flow doesn't mean that none can go the opposite direction. Okay, and that applies to both osmosis and diffusion of other types of molecules. Okay, so now that we've gone through and hopefully you understand some of the mechanisms for how molecules can pass without energy across the membrane, in our next lesson we're going to add in how this relates to a living cell.